Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back, everyone, to another explainer. Today, we're taking a really complex, historical dynamic and breaking it down into something we can actually wrap our heads around. We're looking at a completely fascinating paradox here. We are examining the life of King Solomon. This is a guy who was historically renowned as being incredibly great, unfathomably wealthy, and literally so wise that world leaders would travel across the globe just to hear him speak. Sounds invincible, right? Yet, he's someone who ultimately drifted entirely away from his own foundational beliefs. It's a story we're calling the erosion of a king's heart. And I really want you to lock onto that word for a second. Erosion. Because we aren't talking about a sudden explosion or some massive overnight collapse. We are looking at a slow, almost imperceptible drift away from God. So you have to ask yourself, how does someone so deeply rooted, someone with that much wisdom, just end up losing their way? Well, that is the exact process we're going to unpack for you today.
When we hear about a massive historical failure, or honestly even a personal downfall, our brains naturally want to categorize it as this instant, monumental event. We kind of just picture someone waking up one random Tuesday and deciding to completely abandon all their principles in this one moment of sudden abandonment. But the reality of human nature, and certainly the reality of Solomon's story, is that it's almost always a slow drift. A foundation isn't usually destroyed by a single catastrophic earthquake. No, it's washed away by 1,000 tiny, barely noticeable waves. It is a very gradual descent.
So to really understand this, our primary source material today is the first book of Kings, specifically chapter 11. And look, we aren't just reading ancient history here. We are looking at a profoundly relevant case study in human psychology. This ancient text gives us a meticulous, play-by-play record of exactly how a deeply committed heart just begins to wander. It perfectly outlines the absolute mechanics of compromise. So let's step right into this case study together and map out exactly what that slow drift looks like in actual practice.
We're going to walk step by step through the actual mechanics of Solomon's compromise, because the sequence of events here is incredibly revealing. Notice how casually the whole thing begins. Step 1 was just making political alliances. Now, in the context of running a massive kingdom, this probably seemed completely logical to him, maybe even absolutely necessary for keeping the peace. It was just a pragmatic business decision, right? But that pragmatic decision opened a door, because that leads directly to step 2, which was bringing in foreign wives to cement those political alliances. And guys, we aren't talking about 1 or 2 marriages of convenience here. The historical record literally states he accumulated 700 wives and 300 concubines. What started as basic diplomacy turned into an absolute, unchecked obsession. And with that staggering number of wives came step 3. Pagan practices were slowly introduced right into his own household. And finally, we hit the ultimate consequence, step 4, where idols are actually built throughout the entire land. What started as a seemingly harmless diplomatic strategy ended with a complete, devastating transformation of an entire nation's spiritual landscape. You can see so clearly how Solomon's heart just gradually moved away from God. It was a literal cascade of concessions.
And really, it all comes down to the number 1. This is perhaps the absolute most vital piece of the entire puzzle we're looking at. Solomon's fall didn't happen in one day. It didn't happen in 1 year. It happened exactly one small compromise at a time. It was just one rationalized decision, just one overlooked boundary, just one little exception to the rule. When we look at the end result, the idols built all over the land, it seems impossible to even comprehend how he got there. But when we look at the one, that single isolated choice made in the heat of the moment, it suddenly makes perfect and honestly kind of terrifying sense.
So the crucial point is this: nobody falls overnight. I really want you to let that sink in for a second, because it's huge. Nobody falls overnight. This is the absolute core teaching we are extracting from Solomon's life today. It is a profound, timeless truth about spiritual endurance and human psychology. People don't just wake up and suddenly become someone entirely different. The monumental failures that completely shock us are almost always just the delayed public result of a very long, very private process.
Which brings us right to this working definition. Spiritual failure is not an event. It's a process. And it's a process that always begins with small compromises. We are literally looking at the anatomy of a fall here. The drift always happens on a micro level way before it ever becomes a macro problem. It's those tiny, seemingly insignificant everyday choices that slowly adjust our trajectory. Think about it. A 1-degree shift in your heading might not seem like a big deal on day 1 of a trip, but over the course of a really long journey, that 1 degree completely changes your final destination.
Now, it is incredibly easy to look at historical texts like 1 Kings 11 and just judge a figure like Solomon from a safe distance. But the whole purpose of this explainer is to draw those lessons forward to today. We need a real-life application here. I want to pivot the lens away from ancient history for a minute and point it directly at our own lives and our own daily habits. Because you might be wondering, how does this ancient process look today? The truth is, Christians today generally don't experience a sudden, dramatic abandonment of God. The fundamental mechanics of human nature just haven't changed since Solomon's time. Sure, the environment is completely different, but the actual process of the slow drift, it is exactly the same. And this brilliantly illustrates how we can map Solomon's ancient compromises directly onto our modern lives. Let's look at the symptoms. First, prayer slowly disappears. Notice the word slowly there. It's rarely a conscious, rebellious decision to just stop communicating. It usually just gets squeezed out by the sheer busyness of everyday life, much like Solomon's initial, pragmatic political alliances taking priority over everything else. Second, Bible reading becomes occasional. The foundational text of the faith goes from being a daily anchor to just this sporadic, when I have time kind of activity. And third, in the vacuum left by those first 2 points, worldly influences naturally start to increase. Without the anchor of prayer and scripture, the external culture begins to shape the internal heart, just exactly like how those pagan practices eventually completely took over Solomon's household. The conviction really builds when you look at these 3 points together because they are so incredibly subtle, yet so incredibly dangerous. We've seen the blueprint of the drift. We've seen exactly how it starts small, how it slowly erodes the foundation, and what it looks like for us today, which leaves us with this final thought. Solomon literally had it all. He had political power, he had global alliances, and he had unimaginable wealth. But as his compromises grew, his entire foundation crumbled beneath him. So I leave you with this question to reflect on. Can all the gold in the world satisfy an empty heart? I want you to think about your own foundations today. Take a really hard look at the small compromises in your own life. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.